Fair Source is this new initiative that we've launched that is really about enabling companies to share their core products in ways that they haven't been able to before. Delayed open source publication is really designed to protect against that, to protect against a product being taken in a way that is not good for users, so that users have an option, have an out. Don't start open and then go fair. Go fair from the get-go. And the reason is this. You want to be honest with people up front. Fair Source is essentially trying to prevent the next generation of disasters.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hacking Open Source Business. Today, we have a repeat guest. Chad Whitacre from Sentry is back. So I'm really excited to dig in with him a bit more about some interesting announcements that he has around Fair Source, which we dove into quite a bit last time he was here. If you missed the first episode where we dove into that, definitely encourage you to go check it out. We'll do a little bit of light covering the basics, but we have a lot more stuff to dig into there. I think, last time you were here, Chad, I think we probably could have talked the whole day about this stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot that's happened since then. So thanks for having me back on. Looking forward to getting into it again.
Yeah, same. So, maybe let's just kind of jump into the high level announcements that you have on those updates, and we'll go from there. So tell us the latest.
Sure. So on August 6th, we launched a new initiative called Fair Source. So first of all, who is we? So my name is Chad Whitacre. I'm head of open source at a company called Sentry, which is an error monitoring, application performance monitoring company. And Sentry started life in the open source world as an open source side project in 2008. Now, I think we announced earlier this year 100 million in ARR and 100,000 cloud customers. So very much off and running. And so we is Sentry and some other partner companies. We can get into who those partners are. We launched with about 5 or 6 other companies. And these are companies that, have similar stories to Sentry. Actually, many have closed source products that they wanted to figure out how to share because they kind of had open source affinities, but closed source products. And so Fair Source is this new initiative that we've launched that is really about enabling companies to share their core products in ways that they haven't been able to before. So it launched on August 6th. It's off and running. Fair.io is the website.
Very cool. I think for a lot of the time I was hearing you and other folks from Sentry talk about Fair Source, it seemed like there was kind of a lot of discussion that would go very off the rails very quickly. I remember seeing
that third rail. If you touch that third rail, it's there.
And I remember seeing folks like Adam Jacobs say, you guys should write this down of what are the values? What are you actually optimizing for?
Right.
How did that process, what was the process like of actually codifying this stuff? Was there a lot of input from others? Were there any particularly tough decisions in how you designed it that, maybe could have gone either way and you picked one versus the other? Or was it very clear? Walk us through that a little bit.
Sure. So I'm going to take that in 2 parts because there's a very, very clear answer to the second question about, were there any kind of tough decisions on how we codified this? But I guess a little bit of the storytelling around the process as a whole for getting Fair Source launched. You mentioned Adam. So Adam was a crucial, I think of him as the frog in the hero's quest. Don't tell him I said this. It's too late. Hi, Adam. I love you. Like the call to adventure, right? Like the frog riveting on the edge of the pond, on the edge of the village, like at the village gate, and the hero's quest. So a little backstory. Sentry, like I said, started life as an open source side project in 2008. By the time 2022 rolled around, we were large enough that we were acquiring other companies. So we acquired a company called CodeCov, which is a developer tools company around kind of pre-prod test coverage, primarily code coverage and testing. Okay, so we acquired this company, and CodeCov was a closed source product when we acquired them. And I remember on day one, I happened to be in the office that day, and Eli and Jared got up front and, at an all hands and were introduced. And as soon as they, came back from the front of the room, I said, all right, guys, when are we open sourcing CodeCov? This was like open source is just part of how Sentry operates. So it was a very natural thing when we acquired this closed source company to have that conversation and not just have the conversation, we actually followed through on it. So middle of 2023, we published the source code for CodeCov. We shared the core product. And we announced, to the world on the CodeCov blog that CodeCov is now open source. And here's the catch. We used the business source license. This is ground we've covered, before when I was on the podcast and, that you and your audience are familiar with. So business source license is not open source. And we said it was open source. And so we had this kind of great debate. We call it the CodeCov kerfuffle internally. And but it was an important moment for us. Adam kind of gave us that call to action or that challenge during that time in the middle of 23. Hey, like you said, go figure out your values, articulate what that is, and then brand that. Just stay off the term open source, right? Like let open source mean what it means, and go find a new term. And so we kind of took that challenge at face value and did it. So it took us a year, just about a year exactly. So that's kind of the big story arc. It was a year from when, CodeCov kerfuffle, hey, go find a new term. We emerged out the other end with this term, fair source. So it's a little bit of the high level, but I want to get to your second question about like what, it happened on GitHub. The discussion, the development, happened on GitHub. So, we did get input from a bunch of different folks, which is helpful. The one thing I want to share with you about your question, like, were there any things that were hard to decide? We put in there, fair source is basically defined by two things. It's type of licensing defined by two things. Number one is delayed open source publication. So this is, it's kind of a mouthful of a term. This term came from actually the open source initiative that, sponsored, Sentry sponsored it. We underwrote this paper. OSI went and, hired some folks to write this paper. It's a research paper about this practice in the community and the industry of delayed open source publications. This is business source license and whatnot. After a few years, the code becomes open source. That is one defining aspect of fair source. The other is, permissive style non-compete licenses. So, hey, go do whatever you want with the code, just don't compete with us, and it's cool. So those are the two kind of, basic pillars of the fair source definition. The delayed open source publication was an 11th hour edition. So we were really, it really was like, I remember it as like it was going to be a Tuesday launch on the 6th, and it was Thursday the week before when, we kind of surfaced this question of, is delayed open source publication recommended or is it a requirement? We ended up making a requirement. In hindsight, it was the right decision. We can talk about that more later. But yeah, to answer your question, there were definitely some things to wrestle through in defining it.
I mean, let's talk about this, the delayed publication part a little bit. So okay, sure. I think from the lens of a business, one very clear reason to do this delayed publication is, you're that much closer to open source, right? Like, it from a marketing standpoint and a, value signaling standpoint makes perfect sense. Is anyone really going to use 4-year-old software? Like, does it actually matter? Is there like a real business case for doing this beyond the marketing?
Here's what's interesting. CockroachDB.
Right.
Okay. So CockroachDB was, probably way back in the day was open source and then was BSL, Bustle, I guess. And then since we launched Fair, has tightened up even further. Is essentially just like
fully
we
proprietary.
can call it source available, or is it even just fully proprietary now at this point?
Which is fully locked up
straight
now.
up. Yeah. So they tightened up even further. Oxide,
right.
The hardware company, right? They, is it Brian Cantrell? Like he put out a post.
Brian, we'd love to have you on the podcast if you want to join, by the way.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, my understanding is like they're committed to maintaining a fork of old, like when the time, like when the time comes and there is this time delay, right? But they've committed the company to maintaining a fork of Cockroach based on that old code that was out there. So I think Steve
is that
O'Grady
good for Cockroach though?
Well, no, but that doesn't matter. The point of the delayed open source publication is that it's good for the community. Right. That if a project, if this open-ish project is taken in the wrong direction, is taken in quote unquote the wrong, is taken in a direction that that folks don't like, there is this. It's obviously not the same level of forkability as a pure open source project. It's open source today, but it's something. And so that's been an open question. Like, is it? Is it something? Is it enough? Is it actually impactful? Is it actually meaningful? And this is going to unfold over years because that's sort of like the time frames we're working on. But it is really interesting to see this Cockroach Oxide example crop up, honestly, sooner than I expected. I didn't expect, that we would see this as soon as we did. I thought it might be, the year or two, couple years, 3. So we'll have to keep an eye on it, see if there's more of this, see if it, because it really is for the community. It's like, the word that Cory Doctorow put out there, maybe you can have him on the podcast too, and shitification, platform decay, this idea that like, as what a company's finances get squeezed, they end up adding, filling the product with ads or whatever, right? Like taking it in ways that actually make it worse for users. And and so DOSP, delayed open source publication, is really designed to protect against that, to protect against a product being taken in a way that is, not good for users, so that users have an option, have an out.
So I think, fans of this podcast will know that, I have a lot of differing opinions on I don't know, just all the branch of non-competitive license. And right. Our co-host, Matt Yankovic, used to be the, the one kind of advocating for more of the more traditional open source side. And so in Matt's absence, I'm going to try to play both roles a bit here.
I was going to say, we're in trouble. Yeah, we don't have that counterbalance. Okay.
So I feel like when, some folks might hear that kind of argument and say, well, this example of Oxide using Cockroach might be a very, very particular kind of exception and is like generally, I don't know, like a very, very cherry-picked example. And otherwise, we're basically just putting out stuff that's not very impactful for the sake of saying that we do open source.
Yeah, I mean, look, jury's still out. I think the real value on DOSP is going to, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, do we look back and see, hey, these, maybe Oxide, because honestly, I didn't fully dig into the details of it. They might be maintaining it internally or something like this. Like,
I think
it would be another thing to see a true, Linux Foundation is starting a Valkey, to fork Redis, or like that kind of high profile, true open source fork. I mean, jury's still out, Fair Source. Again, we launched it a month ago, right?
Right. But we do have examples of business source license to go off of. And for instance, like if we look at MariaDB or some of these other databases, I'm not aware. Right. Yeah. And so, it's a question of like, do we think that was a successful outcome for them?
Yeah. And there I would say, yes, you're right. A business source license has been around, 2016?
A while. Yeah, a while.
Even. Yeah, it's been a while, 8 or 10 years. And of course, that delayed open source publication, the point of that paper that OSI put out is like, that goes back to the beginning of open source and probably before,
Right.
GhostScript 1998 was one of the earliest examples we found of that. No, I guess what I'd say there is the business source license is a little bit adopted, but not super widely adopted. Okay,
Yeah.
on the one hand, and on the other hand, it does have this 4-year default change date. Okay, which is pretty long. So
it's quite long. Yeah.
We made this functional source license at Sentry, which is kind of like we took the BSL and kind of cleaned up the worst parts of it and deparameterized it essentially. And one of the things we did is we tightened up the 4-year default to a 2-year fixed date. So every FSL is only 2 years. So you don't have to read the license to know what the date is. It's always 2 years. And it's 2 years instead of 4. That was sort of going back to your earlier question about like what were kind of the debates in that year of developing fair source. Well, I guess the functional source license came out sooner than that, but that was a big debate when we were doing the functional source licenses. We had some folks pushing for 1 year, and other folks saying, "Hey, look, I've worked at companies much larger than Sentry. Sentry's about 350 people." And these are folks coming from, really, truly large enterprises that are like, a year is nothing. You know what I mean? Like a year is nothing. So 2 years was our compromise for the functional source license. But I think it is more real than the 4 years default in BSL. So the idea with functional source license is if we can make it easier to understand and reason about, we can see wider adoption of it. And again, this is a waiting game. This is jury's still out. It's like, let's get 1,000 companies using FSL, and then let's see, 5 years down the road. We just don't have the scale yet to really see. With BSL, we just don't have the scale to really see it.
So if I am a open source startup founder and I'm trying to make this call of should I pick FSL related versus BSL versus AGPL versus SSPL. I think a lot of the AGPL one, I think maybe a little bit separate in terms of kind of the intention of these protections, right? Fundamentally different intention behind these restrictions.
Being a
the others though, sorry?
Being a copyleft license, AGPL?
Well, I guess I think so. On the copyleft side, I think the general argument is, well, these restrictions have the intention of kind of preserving the freedoms, whereas, BUSL, FSL, the restrictions are with the intention of the, economic sustainability of the maintainers. So it's like a different purpose to what the restrictions are designed to do. Whether you agree, I think you could probably argue the fine details there, but I think nevertheless, as we have a lot of these entrepreneurs that might want some of these protections, it might not be clear how to think about the trade-off between these things. And so how would you recommend entrepreneurs think about this decision?
Yeah, great question. Well, and honestly, this was another point of debate in developing fair source is how do we define it and what licenses are we going to include? Because fair source has the same basic shape as the open source initiative, where you've got kind of this high level brand name thing. So open source on the one hand, fair source on the other hand, and there's, fair source we haven't incorporated yet. When we get enough traction, I expect we'll get there.
Don't make the same mistake the OSI did.
With the trademark and everything like that.
With the trademark, yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't know. Do you want to sidebar on that or come back to it? It's like,
we can come back to that later.
Let's put a pin in that and see if we can get back to it. Sure. All right, so you've got fair source, and then under that we have a fair source definition. And the definition of fair source says, I'm trying to read it off our website here. Yeah. So fair.io/about. Fair source is an alternative to closed source, allowing you to safely share access to your core products. Fair source software, number one, is publicly available to read. Number 2 allows use, modification, and redistribution with minimal restrictions to protect the producer's business model. And 3 undergoes delayed open source publication. So those are the 3 criteria for fair source in the fair source definition as it stands today. Okay. And then you've got licenses. So in the same way on the open source side, you've got the OSI, they have a definition, the open source definition, and then they have this license review process where people bring them licenses and say, does this fit your definition? And they, say yay or nay. And then there's a list of the approved licenses on the website. Same thing. Over on fair.io, we have the definition that I just read, and then we have licenses. So the licenses today are the functional source license that we're talking about, Sentry's cleanup of the BSL, what's called the Fair Core license, which another one of the partner companies that launched with us, Keygen, wrote. We can get into that if we want to. And then the business source license, but the caveat there is we have to review every single instance of the business source license because of the additional use grant that basically is this, blank check or this big fill in the blank in the business source license, which makes everyone different. Okay. We were, in trying to decide what the definition of fair source was going to be, a lot of it was sort of like zooming out to the general, but then zooming in and saying, well, does SSPL count? Does ELv2 count? Do we want to include open core as part of fair source? Do we not? These kinds of questions. Okay. Coming back to your question of advice to founders on how to approach this. It really is specific and situational. You understand your business, you understand your business model. I'll say this. The way that fair source landed is with these 3 licenses, with this definition that includes delayed open source publication. That delayed open source publication piece is what kind of pushed out SSPL and ELv2. Okay. So we said those encode kind of the non-compete side that we're looking for, but we really do think that delayed open source publication is a valuable idea. It's worth kind of hanging our hat on. And honestly, it's a big differentiator for us. Because without that, it's like, well, how is this really different than open core or anything else? We wanted fair source to honestly, to be a little bit, maybe this isn't crass or cynical, but differentiated in the market, recognizing that we're bringing this new idea out there. It's like, well, what's unique about it? Yeah, so we committed to delayed open source publication. All right. So I guess let's approach this in two ways. How should you as a founder think about this delayed open source publication? And then, let's get to that second, because if we're keeping within the fair source tent here and saying, all right, let's say maybe you get the idea, you're like, cool, I like delayed open source publication. It brings me closer to open source, as close as I can be. If you're good with that, the 2 basic options in fair source for you are this functional source license and this fair core license, okay? And it really comes down to your business model. So if you as a founder have a business model that leans heavily on self-hosting, on people running your software on-prem, okay? If you need to monetize that's your business model, look at the fair core license. That's what that license is designed to do, is to say, you can run this software, but there may be some limits when you run the software, at which point, you'll need a license key or it'll stop working or whatever, right? So if you need to monetize self-hosted and on-prem, look at the fair core license. If you're comfortable, and this is where Sentry's at, if you're primarily or exclusively monetizing with SaaS, then look at the functional source license. The functional source license says, we're not monetizing self-hosted. You can take this code and run it as much as you want internally. We're building our business on SaaS, and that's the kind of point of competition that we're preventing. Okay. Maybe that's a little long-winded, but I'd say if you're on board with the delayed open source publication, you're on board with fair source, you want to think about what your business model is If it's a SaaS business model, look at functional source license. If you've got more complex needs that involve self-hosting and on-prem monetizing that, then look at the Fair Core license. Is that somewhat helpful?
Definitely. Yeah. I
It's
think
really about business model.
Right, which is interesting in the sense that, typically when we talk about picking an open source license, it's a little bit decoupled from the business model a little bit. And, we say like open source is not a business model. And,
Exactly.
you're trying to kind of think about the right way to, keep, whether it's trademark, whether it's, whatever it might be, that you're just thinking about kind of these more fine grained considerations, where here what you're saying is, well, whether you're choosing SaaS or on-prem is a huge decision point, and pick the license that best suits that.
Yeah.
However, I think one thing that we've learned on this podcast from the other founders that we've talked to is that you often don't know which to pick ahead of time.
Yeah.
So what do you do? What's the solution to that?
Well,
is it to start open source and then to restrict things as you need to?
Please no. Please no. That would be the main thing not to do. If there's one takeaway here, don't start open and then go fair. Go fair from the get-go. And the reason is this. You want to be honest with people up front, okay?
Yeah.
Let's actually zoom out a little bit. This is very important to talk about. This is behind, all our conversations with Adam and everybody else that kind of led to FAIR in the first place. Since the beginning of open source, there's been a tension between two kinds of governance, okay? I don't know if that's a word that gets brought up on this podcast very much. But
yeah, it does.
Governance. Okay, cool. Governance of projects, okay? Is a project owned and governed by a single company, or is it owned and governed by, generally at scale, it's a nonprofit foundation that involves multiple companies that are, have their own businesses that are using the open source project in whatever way they want. Okay. So that distinction in governance is absolutely critical to understanding what's going on with open source and fair source. Because what we've seen over the years is that when we try to house both of those kind of models, governance models, within the umbrella term of open source, that's where we get the flare-ups. That's where we get the fighting over the soul of open source. It's like, and again, I actually have a post called The Historical Case for Fair Source, where I go into this history and I look the whole way back to the beginning with Netscape, which was the first open source project in the sense that we know today. Now, the term open source, it turns out, predates the OSI. That's a whole nother question. But, OSI as we know it, open source as we know it, started with the publication of the Netscape Communicator source code in 1998. And, that's when, these free software activists came up with this new brand to make the movement more accessible to folks with this, kind of landmark moment of Netscape releasing their source code. The whole way back to there, you've got this question of the tension between a single company trying to maintain control over a project, trying to own the roadmap, and kind of give themselves a privileged place in commercialization. Tension between that and kind of the community, more democratic, kind of nonprofit foundation managed projects. Fair source is essentially trying to prevent the next generation of disasters. Like the next generation of companies starting out with an open source development model, but limiting the governance, right? Holding kind of using the governance as kind of a choke point, or I think Dirk really uses this term control point, that it's like, well, so the license is an open source license, but if I'm the only one that has commit access and every decision has to go through my company and we don't share the roadmap or the kind of share that ownership of the project with the community, then the license almost doesn't matter at that point, right? It's like, is it truly an open source project. But that's because open source has been defined only by the licensing and not by the governance. We've had this ambiguity that's led to all this conflict over the years. So a big part of what we're trying to do with fair source is, again, prevent the next generation of disasters, of kerfuffles, of kind of fighting over this by saying, look, let's give companies a way from the beginning to be honest, to say, we want to develop this product openly as we can. We want to share the source code with you. We want you to be able to run it to a certain extent yourself. We want you to be able to read it, to give us pull requests if you're so motivated, to engage with us on GitHub or whatever. We want you to be able to do that. And we want to be honest that, like, this is our project. Like, we own this. We're not asking for your shared governance with us. Like, that's not what we're doing here. Giving the industry, giving the next generation of founders a way to be honest about that up front, that's what we're going after with fair source. Does that help at all, Avi? Does that make any sense?
Oh, no, I think definitely. But I think one thing that this is maybe one of those spots where I have a really out there opinion, or like it is really I'm trying to resolve this, and we're just going to work through it right now.
Okay, let's do it.
So to me, I feel like I think one of the maybe philosophies here is that we like the values of open source, and we're going to make kind of the minimum amount of practical trade-offs that are necessary in order to preserve those values as much as possible while keeping the lights on, having a sustainable business, all those things.
We were on that thread together, right? With
exactly.
Matt and Adam. Figuring out like what's the you're absolutely right.
And I really like that. I like that a lot. Now, I feel like it's possible to go out the gate and say, hey, we're doing this as open source, but we have a business behind us. There may be a future where we need to introduce certain restrictions, and we might actually need to reach for FSL or something similar. I'm setting your expectations up front about this. And we are going to basically keep things as open as possible and add the restrictions as we go. I feel like if everybody did that, that would actually be better. Like, you may not need to add restrictions later. And it sometimes almost seems like a shame that we reach for those restrictions prematurely if they're not actually required.
I mean, Dirk does say this as well in another post. He's like, it's a sign of success when a project relicenses.
Right.
It takes, because what they've done is they've kind of proven the value there. Like the VC-backed company has you found the product market fit, right? It's like, there's a there. And now the relicensing is saying, and of course there's going to be a fork when a relicense happens, and that's all fine. From a certain point of view, that, I don't know, man, like, people get really upset about
they do
rug pulls.
And right. And so I talk about this a lot in my talks around responsible analytics, is that I've kind of started talking about this concept of expectation fit, where if you do something that does not match your community's expectations, basically the negativity of the reaction is just that delta, right? If you do something that's totally in line with what you told people you're going to do, no one's really going to care. And if we set expectations up in advance, my expectations would be that people would not really mind quite as much, because we definitely see that with analytics. When a company kind of says from the very beginning, like, hey, this is our commercial product, here's what we're going to track. We might track stuff later too. We found that it doesn't really impact things too much. But maybe the last point that I'll make here is that I'd much rather be someone like Databricks, where you never have to relicense, versus being Mongo, where if I have to choose between being Mongo and Databricks, I'd much rather be Databricks.
Well, Elastic just went back, right?
Right. So I had this as something that I want to get back to. So I feel, there's so much here. So I think that Elastic seems to be this very interesting example where having the restrictions actually provided the outcome. They got the partnerships that they needed.
Mm-hmm. But
then they went back to open source, because that's the ideal?
It really, I'm going to cough.
We'll cut
Can
it.
edit that out.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like a very unique case. Who knows if it's repeatable? My sense is, those of us who spent a lot of our careers in open source feel really passionately about it, one way or another, and identify with. I mean, this is true of me. Like speaking for myself, I've thought my whole career, like, I'm in open source. I'm going to open source meetups. I'm going to open source conferences. It's like, it means a lot to me personally. Like, I'm very invested in, being an open source developer, being a member of the community. And it's very understandable, for someone in Shai's position to have to, like, it was surely very painful to have to relicense away from open source. And, you can just tell that he's so excited to be able to kind of rejoin the mainstream of open source on a personal level. And it's wonderful. My understanding is that his hope is that he can work with OSI to find a better version of a copyleft license that works better for a company like Elastic. That, like, what SSPL tried to do, for example.
Right.
Like SSPL, they tried really hard, which came from Mongo. They tried really hard to get it approved by OSI. Like versus business source license, where there was never any pretense that it was going to be approved by OSI, right?
Mm-hmm.
SSPL was like, no, we want this to be like, we think that we're operating in the kind of the spirit of open source, and we want this license to be approved. And it wasn't. But I think that's kind of the glimmer of hope, is like, by relicensing, by adding AGPL back in the mix, we can kind of like build a closer relationship with OSI and maybe find something beyond AGPL, and AGPL 4, right? Isn't that what we're on? Like, would be the next version,
yeah.
Or like some variant of SSPL or something. I don't know. I don't have a ton of knowledge of exactly what they're trying to do there, but I've seen it. Not even reading between the lines. Like, there's some comments that Shai's made in the announcements about Elastic's, going back to open source. I mean, we could dig them up here if we wanted the quotes. Yeah. So, and I guess on the one hand, I love that they were able to do that. And I'm so happy for Shai personally and Elastic and the team that they're able to kind of rejoin the mainstream of open source. To me, it still doesn't resolve that fundamental question of governance. I guess I genuinely think that this question of governance is worth adopting a new term over. Like, and this is probably mostly me, speaking personally, maybe with a Sentry hat on. Like, I actually think open source should be defined in terms of governance. Like, there's kind of this debate on, the open source definition, and should the open source definition be updated, since it hasn't been in 25 years and was just sort of cobbled together back then. And like, okay. But, there's two different ways that you could go with that. It's like, are you updating the open source definition to make it more friendly to companies like Sentry and Elastic that want to consider themselves open source but aren't today? Or are you updating the open source definition to exclude companies like Sentry and Elastic and et cetera, right? And gosh, am I going to go out and say this? Yeah. Like, I think that it would be neater and tidier to update open source, maybe in the open source definition, maybe in some other way, to say governance matters. Like, if a project is not governed openly, and honestly, this could get us into, I don't know how much time we want to, what rabbit holes we want to chase here. Everything that's happening in Europe with the CRA legislation that is creating this new category of open source software stewards, elevating the foundations that we have to this kind of more privileged place. Yeah, like I'm pretty on board with open source. Let's let that refer to openly governed projects. And look, Sentry has some of these. Like we've got true open source projects that are infrastructure projects that we share with others, even some competitors. And, we run them openly. Okay. So that's open source. They're not mutually exclusive. Like open source and fair source. Open source is great for shared infrastructure. It's like companies that are otherwise competing can work together on this shared infrastructure. Fair source is for closed source products, a company's core products. How do you open those up? I can keep ranting, but this, I can see the wheels turning over there.
Yeah, definitely. So I think a few things here. So one, is it fair? So would you agree with the statement that if you intend to retain full control over governance indefinitely, fair source is a good option, and you are essentially foregoing the option that it would ever be multi-vendor?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Fair source is for a company's core products. So, one kind of bumper sticker, whatever I like to say is like, think about the big open source successes. Kubernetes is open source. Google search is not open source.
Right. Okay. So then
React is open source. Facebook newsfeed is not open source. Linux is open source. Amazon Web Services is not open source. Yes. Right. So fair source is for your core products.
So fair source, we say, okay, so just to kind of restate this, because I'm about to get to the the next piece of this. So if we say that fair source is a single vendor operation, open source is one or more. Yeah, not necessarily, but probably, right? So then if that's the case,
if you're successful, right?
If you're successful. If that's the case, I feel that directly undermines the value of the delayed open source publication. There's not going to be a multi-vendor. It's not going to be a multi-vendor group governing this downstream 2 to 4 year old thing, especially if single vendor is upstream calling all the shots.
You're really skeptical of delayed open source publication.
No, I'm not. Well,
you don't think it matters. You think it's open washing.
No. I think what I'm trying to get into here, I think, is like I'm trying to get into the business case of it. Like why a business should really care about this is really what I'm trying to get at. And this is coming from a spot of, I'm very interested in the kind of, the kind of models and licenses, et cetera, that set businesses up for success in, whatever all these values around open source. Yeah, and as you said, jury's still out if this is kind of the right way to go about it. But I think that's maybe one disconnect that I'm having with it is that if we're saying like, it's about the governance, well, here is a place where it doesn't seem to really be about the governance at all. And I kind of want us to get to a spot, like I want to see personally, now I'm speaking for me here, I want to see fair source be in a spot where it can kind of be bulletproof against the like real traditional open source crowd. And I see this as a potential objection.
Well, good luck on that.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it will ever be bulletproof
That's fair.
against the traditional open source crowd. Let's go back to this question of business models and when fair source is a good option. I think the customer you're trying to serve is a really important question here.
Yeah.
Think about why you want to open source your core product anyway, because you're probably selling to developers. You're building a database. You're building, Sentry's doing error monitoring, right? Like you're doing command line tools or something, right? Like you're building, like when your customer is the developer, when you're building developer tools, that's where the benefits of open source shine, because you've got not just the potential of people contributing to development of your thing, but you're building, it's marketing is what it is, right? It's like you're building this marketing base, you're proving out the desire for your product, through essentially a freemium model. And so in the same way that open source is most compelling to developer tools companies, Fair source is likewise most compelling to developer tools companies because it gives you similar benefits in the marketing, okay, in the community engagement, in just building goodwill with developers who like to go on GitHub and kick the tires and poke around and, you know, file bugs on GitHub, right? Like having that is valuable to that specific audience. So companies in that space, you know, in the same way that open source has been compelling to companies in that space. That's the best fit for fair source. You know, do we ever get to a world where the next, you know, Google search or Facebook news feed is a fair source product? I mean, I can imagine it, but it's a few hops and steps and a jump away from where we are today. I think the most compelling, Facebook or fair source is most compelling to these developer tools companies. Okay. Then having said that, coming back to this question of what's the value of delayed open source publication on the business side, it really is this olive branch. You know, it really is this, you know, hey, developers, right? Like, we really are trying to do our best here. You know, like, here's this thing. We're going to try and build a business around it. You know, if it doesn't pan out, if we belly up or, you know, take it in the wrong direction or whatever, or even relicense again, right? Like, because you can certainly go from a fair source, like we just saw with Cockroach, that went from a business source license to a much more restricted license. You know, what people get most frustrated about is, going back to your thing earlier, expectations. You know, like, people have such strong ingrained expectations of what free and open source software means that, like, that's where any whiff, and these different expectations have lived, you know, we've lived in the same tent, have been under the same umbrella for decades. And so what we're trying to do is say, like, there's just some different expectations here. Like, let's be honest about the expectations. Fair source, we could relicense. Yes, we could relicense to something more restrictive. And that's where the value of the delayed open source comes in, is it's an olive branch. It's saying, if we do this, you'll at least have this. You know?
I think that, I mean, I do think that this might diminish over time, but I think right now, if you choose a fair source license, it's a very strong signal to your community about what they should expect from you. I think that's actually a very powerful thing, because I think that, well, both on the open source side, but also just, like, you know, managing teams. Like, you know, I've talked to lots of CTOs and, you know, asked them, like, you know, what's the hardest part of your job? And the managing expectations is invariably what they say.
Okay.
And I think that it's a lot easier said than done. And I think that if I have any advice for founders and entrepreneurs about this, I think it's thinking very critically about how you manage the expectations of your community and your team and your investors and your, you know, all of these different groups. And so I actually feel like that is perhaps a very underrated benefit of choosing a license like this, is that it's very explicit about what you are trying to do. That's very, very interesting. And I guess I'm curious to what, you know, how that will change over time as more companies adopt fair source. And I'm sure it'll evolve over time as well.
I mean, the true ideal would be that 10 years from now, every developer tools company is fair source. That would be sort of like the first saturation point. You know, is that 10 or 15 years from now, when you start a developer tools company, this is just how it's done, is it's fair source. And that's the, you know, what we've negotiated between, again, community and corporations. So much we could get into here about how humans organize themselves, you know, to get stuff done, right? And like, and these different models between corporations and communities are kind of open models. We'll see. Jury's still out.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to watch. And so I guess, like, in the meantime, you know, you have fair.io, this, you know, this site that has information on, you know, the different licenses, about the values. And interestingly, the companies that have announced adopting a fair source license. I guess like just taking a look at some of this. So I see, So I think so. Obviously, Sentry and CodeCov are here. I see Git Butler, who, for those that don't know, is from one of the co-founders of GitHub. Keygen, PowerSync, and Code Crafters. What do you think is? I don't know what kind of characteristics do you notice about these companies that's worth pointing out? And I guess maybe interestingly, like, what do you think is missing for much larger companies to adopt this? I guess Sentry is kind of an order of magnitude bigger than any of these companies. So Sentry is one, but
no, you're right. So these are all, again, developer focused, right? So Git Butler is a desktop Git client. Keygen, this is sort of meta. I mean, Keygen's a license key server. Okay.
That makes sense for them.
Yeah, exactly. Our interests are aligned, I guess you might say. No, and actually I should say this. Fair Source's own governance is pretty lightweight because we're still early days. But Zeke, who's the founder of Keygen, Zeke has been very involved in developing Fair Source. And he and I are kind of the two that are running it day to day. When somebody comes in and says, "Hey, what about this new license?" or has a question, Zeke is doing a lot of great work, kind of representing Fair Source out on Hacker News and et cetera, out in the wild, and helping run the project. So shout out Zeke. So Keygen, and then PowerSync is a local first kind of database sync product. That one. Well, let me round out. And then Code Crafters is kind of developer education. So it's build your own Git, build your own database, build your own Redis from scratch to learn how these things are done.
Shout out to Sarup if you're listening to this.
Oh, cool.
I know Sarup from Code Crafters. Yeah,
nice. So Paul, his co-founder, he and I worked together a while ago.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. PowerSync, though, I want to say, especially with PowerSync is a product that came out of a company called Journey Apps. If I have it right, forgive me if I'm doing it wrong. Let's do it. Journey Apps. And they developed this behind closed doors for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
Before they published the code. Okay. So I love this as an example because it shows kind of, this Fair Source is not an alternative to open source. It's an alternative to closed source. These companies, and actually this is true for all these. So we already mentioned Sentry is the only one on this list that went from open source to fair source. Everything else on this list went from closed source to fair source. Okay. And it was only because fair source existed that these founders had this option of saying, I really want to be open source, but I'm also trying to build this business. What are my options? And fair source is saying, hey, here's the path. Here's the easy button, right? Like here's Sentry's done this. Like we've fought the battles and gone down the rabbit holes and figured this out. And here's the best practices. Use one of these licenses and these should cover 99% of the use cases out there. Okay. Yes, but I love that the 10 years on PowerSync is that was cool. It's because that's a big decision. You're a founder. You're running a business. I mean, that's a really big decision to go to all the work to clean up your code and publish it and everything like that. And to trust us enough and to kind of throw in with the brand and say, we'll put our weight behind this fair source thing. That means a lot.
Are there, on the Sentry side, particular deals or partnerships or things that concrete business outcomes that you can point to that would not have been possible without the restrictions?
Well, yeah. I mean, we've got our origin story on the relicense is 2019 when GitLab was going to steal our lunch. That was the threat. They were going to start offering a Sentry, the Sentry hosting as part of their suite, right? Because GitLab is a very broad surface area. And, just natural fit from their point of view to bring this open source project in and just slot it right in. So that was really the origin story for Sentry on relicensing to the business source license. And it worked. We've got, and a lot of this is honestly out in public. You can see, when we relicensed, we announced it. And then in our forum, product manager, I don't have the name, from GitLab showed up, was like, hey, congratulations, I'm from GitLab. Does this mean we can't do our thing anymore? And David Kramer's like, yes, that is exactly what it means. You can't do your thing. So for us, it wasn't
working as
Jeff.
intended.
Yes, working as intended. Close issue. This concept of getting Jeffed, right? That I forget the fellow's name. I don't have it. That came up with coined this cute term to Jeff Bezos stealing your lunch, with AWS. For us, it was what, I hate to say it, Sid, I love you, but getting sidded or whatever, was our version of that. So concrete business outcome for us from relicensing was, it protected our business. It allowed us to keep investing because, all right, here's another thing that I think is interesting and valuable to discuss. Motivations for contributing to open source. Motivations for contributing to, let's say, a public code base that accepts contributions, because now there's these two things. You got open source and you got fair source. A lot of the ire about rug pulls comes from this change in expectations where a developer makes a contribution to a project that is under an open source license. And there's this implicit expectation about governance, that it will be this kind of multi-vendor community thing, and then feels betrayed. The developer feels betrayed because now this company has taken their contribution, which was freely offered, and has, sequestered it away and said, now this is only ours and we're the only ones that can benefit from it. Okay. There are multiple motivations for contributing to a public code base.
Totally.
For myself, when I joined Sentry, when I applied as part of my application to make my application stand out, I went into their code base, not to the main Sentry code base, but to the self-hosted code base, because that was related to the role I was applying for. And I started making a few PRs. Did I have to do that? No. Did Sentry ask me to do that as part of my, free work as part of my, job application? No. Did it help me stand out in the job application process? Absolutely. So I had my own motivations for contributing to Sentry's public project. I don't have any qualms at all that they took my, few little PRs and are quote unquote, making money off it or whatever, right? That I'm not participating in the commercial benefits of, this project or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
Also with that, another example from my own experience, Plausible, which had been AGPL. Plausible is the Google Analytics alternative, kind of a, EU hosted, privacy focused Google Analytics. Okay. And they have this whole open source story. They were AGPL, and then I think they might be open core now. I don't have the details on that one.
I don't have my head either. Watch the show notes.
I actually fixed a bug in Plausible, or added a few, there was something in Plausible. I gave them a contribution. It worked like it's, supposed to work. It's I'm using this project. And that's an interesting one, because it's not even really focused at developers. Their market is marketers, right? The people, maybe they've got, there's developers that want to use Google Analytics, but it's primarily marketing folks, right? They're going to be using it. Okay. I was using it. There was some small thing about, how dates were shown on the chart or whatever that, it wasn't how I wanted it to be. So I gave them a little PR and they merged it. And so now I have my code in Plausible and everybody else is benefiting from it. Am I resentful that they're a company that is now relicensed and taken that away? No, actually, I'm grateful that they're a company that is maintaining my contribution. It's I fired this thing at them and I forgot about it. My problem solved. And I've got somebody else that's maintaining my work into the future. I don't have to stick around and be the guy that owns this feature now. You know what I mean? It's I give it to them and they run with it. That's a great benefit to me. So I don't know. I see when we talk about can we make this bulletproof against the diehard open source free software folks? the answer is no, but like the kind of where I kind of draw a line and say, like, if you can't see this, I can't help you, is like, people have different motivations for contributing to a project.
Very
and
true.
Fair source really does give you that possibility. With fair source software, you really do have that possibility of this story that I'm telling, of the, like, I'm using the software, I don't like something about it, I can open the hood, there is a right to repair, I can either fix it for myself and run that privately, or I can share the contribution upstream and have that, the possibility of that being taken up into the product. So there's real value there in fair source. And if folks can't see it, I can't help them at some level. But my hope is that enough people are able to see it that, yeah.
And I think, as we said earlier, that I think, initiatives like this take time to prove out one way or another. And I think that, one thing that, I personally really love about this initiative here is that it just is the case that I think there are some aspects to open source that don't work for everybody in all cases. Right. And I think trying to explore other ways to address them is a very, very good thing. I think for folks listening, like, whether or not you agree with the particular set of choices that were made here, I think most people would agree that these kinds of things are very worth trying and trying to, figure out if they do or do not work, and do they not make things better, and how does that impact, the ecosystem. And so I commend you guys for thinking about this very deeply and writing it down and giving it a try. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what becomes of this effort. We are winding down on time here. And so I think I just want to see, is there any other asks that you have for the audience? Is there anything else that you'd like to plug or draw their attention to?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the leading question. The flip side, so Fair Source is one of two big initiatives that Sentry is working on this year. Fair Source launched August 6th, fair.io. The other big thing that's coming down the pike is open source pledge. So that's the flip side of the coin in some ways. Open source pledge is about changing the status quo on open source sustainability. So these projects that are truly open source, that are community governed, and that maybe don't have the budget to, this is the whole pay the maintainers thing. This is the XKCD dependency comic, right? The Nebraska
classic.
Project. Yes. Open source pledge, we're working to change the status quo on companies paying maintainers to, prevent the sort of burnout related security incidents that we see with XZ and Log4Shell and Heartbleed. OSSpledge.com is the website for that one. That one is launching on October 8th. So we'll see kind of when the timing of this, this episode gets out there. But we've already soft launched it. We're already off and running. Major billboard campaign billboards are going up in San Francisco. 3 really, interesting. It's going to be fun. Putting 3 billboards on the Skyway in San Francisco. NASDAQ is helping us out with the NASDAQ Tower in Times Square.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. That's basically the whole month of October. Digital marketing around it as well. So if you want to get in on the ground floor, if your company supports open source maintainers and you want to kind of throw your weight behind this, really kind of trying to change the norm in the industry around this, we would love to have your help. OSSpledge.com.
Very, very cool. Well, you heard it here first. Look for some billboards. I'm excited. I'm sure I'm going to see them as I drive into the city. So very cool. Well, everyone, thanks so much for tuning in and listening. We're all going to be, really excitedly watching how Fair Source evolves from here. So thanks again. If you if you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. Please hit that like button, and we will see you next time. Thanks again, Chad.
Ask me questions. I'm happy to answer any questions about Fair Source. We'll get you onboarded. Avi, thanks so much for having me.
Where do people find you?
Well, I mean, I'll watch those YouTube comments. You
Cool.
can go through fair.io and get to our GitHub from there and ask questions there, or Chad Whitacre at Sentry.io.
Thanks again, Chad.
Awesome. Thanks, Avi.